In August of 1951, the most powerful newspaper publisher in American history died in a bedroom of a Beverly Hills mansion that did not belong to him. He had lived in that mansion for the final years of his life, tended by the woman he had loved for 34 years. He was 88 years old. He had built an empire of newspapers and magazines and radio stations and film studios and castle collections that stretched across the continent. He had made presidents and destroyed careers, and shaped public opinion across 5 decades with the blunt, operatic force of a man who had decided very early that reality was something you could rewrite if you owned enough of the presses doing the printing. His wife of 48 years, Millicent Hearst, was not in the room when he died. The woman who was in the room, the woman who had been in the room for 3 decades, who had sat with him through his decline, who had been there every day of his final years, was his mistress. When he died, his family came to collect the body. They did not tell her. She was sedated in another room, and when she woke up, the man she had organized her entire life around for 34 years was gone. His body had been taken. His family had arrived. His wife of 48 years would handle the funeral arrangements. She said afterward that she did not even know he was dead until she woke up and the house was empty. Her name was Marion Davies. She had been 19 years old when she met the 53-year-old William Randolph Hearst in the chorus line of the Ziegfeld Follies of 1916. She had been his mistress for 34 years. She had been the most lavishly promoted actress in Hollywood history, the star of 45 films, the hostess of the most extravagant parties the golden age of the film industry had ever produced. She had given him $156 million worth of publicity, career management, and devotion. She had also, in 1941, watched the greatest film director of his generation release a movie that the entire world understood to be about her and about Hearst, and that portrayed her as a pathetic, untalented woman whose only significance was her connection to a powerful man. She had never publicly said a word against it. The name of the film was Citizen Kane. The name it gave her was Susan Alexander, and the damage it did to her reputation was, by the assessment of the man who made it, his greatest professional regret. In the next hour you will learn what actually happened on the night a Hollywood producer died on William Randolph Hearst's yacht, and who the evidence suggests pulled the trigger. You will learn about the secret daughter that Marion Davies and Hearst concealed for 60 years, hidden inside their own household as a niece, revealed only on a deathbed in 1993. And you will learn what Marion Davies actually wrote, in the private audio diaries she left behind, about the man who gave her everything, and also, without quite meaning to, took everything away. This is the story of Marion Davies, not the Susan Alexander version, the real one. She was born Marion Cecilia Duras on the 3rd of January, 1897, in Brooklyn, New York, the youngest of 5 children. Her father, Bernard J. Duras, was a lawyer who would eventually serve as a New York City magistrate from 1918 to 1930. He was a man of modest financial standing and considerable Irish-American political ambition, the kind of figure who populated the lower rungs of New York's Democratic Party machine at the turn of the century. Useful, well-connected, never quite wealthy, always slightly in debt to the expectations of his position. Her mother, Rose Riley Duras, managed a household of 5 children on the East Coast income of a mid-level lawyer with the particular competence that large Irish-American families of that era required. The family lived near Prospect Park in Brooklyn, a respectable neighborhood, not a wealthy one. There was enough for school, enough for church, not enough for the kind of ease that the children would eventually manufacture for themselves through talent and determination. Marion's older brother Charles drowned in a boating accident in 1906. He was 15 years old. Marion was 9. She would later give his name to her favorite nephew, the screenwriter Charles Lederer, the son of her sister Rina, an act of memorial that says something about how deeply that loss registered in a family that did not, by every account, speak about it much. The 3 older sisters, Raina, Ethel, and Rose, all went into performing. It was, in the specific social geography of New York in the first decade of the 20th century, one of the available paths for daughters of Irish-American families who were bright and ambitious and attractive and did not have the connections or the capital to enter the professions that required them. The stage was accessible. The stage paid. The stage, if you were good enough, could take you somewhere the law, degree, or the magistrate's appointment could not. Marion watched her sisters perform from the time she was old enough to be taken to rehearsals, and she absorbed the ambition along with the craft. She had a stutter that had begun in childhood and that would never entirely leave her, a childhood vulnerability that multiple public schools in Brooklyn declined to accommodate, eventually resulting in her enrollment in a convent school in Hastings, New York, where the nuns treated her stutter with a combination of patience and prayer that the public school system had not offered. She was 13 years old when she made her first stage appearance in the chorus of a small Broadway revue. She was, by every surviving account from this period, not the most technically polished of the Duras daughters, but she was something else, the one whose presence in a room was immediately apparent, whose quality of attention and humor and physical ease in front of an audience created the distinct impression that the stage was something she had been doing all her life rather than something she had recently started. By 1914, she was appearing on Broadway in the musical Chin Chin. By 1916, she had been cast in the Ziegfeld Follies. The Duras sisters had by this point changed their surname. Walking past a real estate sign in Brooklyn one afternoon, one of the sisters pointed to the name on the board, Davies, and declared it their new stage name. The entire family took it. Marion Duras became Marion Davies. The name on the real estate sign was Welsh in origin. It sounded British. In New York in the 1910s, sounding British was a significant social advantage for girls from Irish families trying to build careers on stages where the highest status performers had English names. She was 19 years old, performing in the Ziegfeld Follies of 1916, when a man in the audience began paying particular attention to her. William Randolph Hearst was 53 years old when he first noticed Marion Davies. He had been married to Millicent Wilson since 1903. They had 5 sons together: George, William Randolph Jr., John, and twins Randolph and David. The couple had separated in 1919, though they would never divorce. Millicent, a devout Catholic, refused to grant the divorce that would have freed Hearst to formalize his relationship with Marion, and Hearst, despite everything, continued to support his wife and his sons financially for the rest of his life. Hearst had built by 1916 the largest media empire in America. He owned newspapers in every major city. He owned magazines including Cosmopolitan, Harper's Bazaar, and Good Housekeeping. He would eventually own radio stations and newsreel companies and a film production company that he would found specifically and entirely for the purpose of making Marion Davies a star. He sat in the front row of the Ziegfeld Follies. Marion Davies later said, in the private audio diaries she recorded in the 1950s, that she had noticed him there every night. "I didn't know Mr. Hearst then," she said, "but he always sat in the front row. He arranged an introduction, then another, then dinners, then the particular escalation of attentions that a 53-year-old man with more money than any institution he had ever encountered had decided to deploy in the direction of a 19-year-old chorus girl who had caught his notice and would not leave it." The age difference was 34 years. This fact exists in the historical record with the impassivity of arithmetic, 34 years. And the people who knew both of them in the early years of the relationship, who watched the 53-year-old media titan pursue the 19-year-old performer with the single-minded devotion that would characterize his attention to her for the next 3 decades. S. described it with the particular delicacy of people who understood that Hearst was the most powerful man most of them would ever know, and that his romantic arrangements were not something they were going to comment on critically while he was in the room. Marion was not unaware of the power dynamic. She was not unaware of what it meant to attract the devoted attention of the most powerful newspaper publisher in America. She had grown up watching her sisters navigate the entertainment industry with the practical intelligence of women who understood the terrain. She was 19 years old, and she was sharp and funny, and she had a stutter and a talent for comedy, and she was in the Ziegfeld Follies, and a 53-year-old man was sitting in the front row every night. In 1918, Hearst founded Cosmopolitan Pictures, a film production company. Its sole and explicit purpose was the promotion and advancement of the career of Marion Davies. He signed her to an exclusive contract at $500 a week. He was 55 years old. She was 21. He had, by this point, moved her mother and her sisters into a Manhattan townhouse at 331 Riverside Drive that he paid for. He had begun assigning reporters from his newspapers to cover Marion's social activities as a matter of daily editorial policy. He had instructed his newsreel division to feature her in regular segments. He had announced to every person in a position to understand the announcement that Marion Davies was the woman whose career he intended to make, and that the resources available to him for this project were essentially unlimited. The estimated value of the promotion Hearst poured into Marion Davies's career across the following 2 decades is, in 2025 dollars, $156 million. What none of these numbers capture is this: he was also in love with her. Genuinely, completely, in the particular way of men who have spent decades being the most powerful person in every room they enter and who are undone, finally, by someone who does not treat them as the most powerful person. In 1922, Marion Davies appeared in When Knighthood Was in Flower, a historical epic produced by Cosmopolitan Pictures at a cost of $1.8 million. The most expensive picture ever made at the time. It was a massive commercial success. The following year, she appeared in Little Old New York, another Hearst-backed historical epic, another commercial triumph. By 1924, Marion Davies was the #1 female box office star in Hollywood. This fact, that Marion Davies was, in 1924, the most commercially successful female film star in America, is not the fact that people remember. The fact people remember is Citizen Kane. The fact people remember is Susan Alexander, the untalented mistress, propped up by a powerful man's money and his need. The discrepancy between the fact and the memory is the central injustice of Marion Davies's story. She was talented. She was specifically talented in comedy, a comedian of the first rank, by the assessment of every qualified observer who actually watched her films. Charlie Chaplin, who did not give compliments lightly, and who had other, more complicated reasons for being close to the Hearst-Davies circle, told people privately that Marion was one of the most naturally gifted comic performers he had seen on screen. The film critic Pauline Kael wrote in 1971 that Marion Davies had been a major leading lady who had not needed the drumbeaters of the Hearst empire to remain in the movies. The film historian Kevin Brownlow went further. He called her arguably the best female comedienne on screen. And what did Hearst do with this gift? He put her in costume dramas. He put her in ponderous historical epics. He refused, consistently, and with the specific blindness of a man who confused what he wanted to see with what audiences wanted to watch, to let her be funny, because he did not want her to be laughed at, and he could not distinguish between an audience laughing at his beloved and an audience laughing with her. Her directors understood this distinction. The directors who worked with her in comedy, King Vidor, who made Show People with her in 1928, a film in which she satirized the entire Hollywood star system with a self-awareness and timing that made it one of the great comic films of the silent era, understood that what they had was exceptional. In The Patsy, made the same year, she performed impersonations of Lillian Gish, Mae Murray, and Pola Negri that were so precise and so funny that audiences who had come expecting a period drama were left with something that felt like a revelation. Then, Hearst would pull her back. Another historical epic, another solemn drama with a literary pedigree, another production in which the full lavishness of the Cosmopolitan budget was deployed to create something grand and serious and commercial. She tried to leave MGM for United Artists, where she felt the creative atmosphere would suit her better. Hearst refused. He had his reasons. He always had his reasons, and they were always, underneath the commercial justifications, the same reason. She was not going to be somewhere he could not control. Irving Thalberg, the production chief at MGM, who was arguably the most sophisticated creative mind in the studio system, wanted to cast Marion in Marie Antoinette. He lobbied for it. He believed the combination of her comic instincts and the production resources available at MGM could produce something remarkable. Hearst refused. He insisted that Marion play the role of Elizabeth Barrett Browning instead. Then Thalberg gave Marie Antoinette to his own wife, Norma Shearer. Hearst reacted by pulling Cosmopolitan Pictures out of MGM entirely and moving the distribution deal to Warner Brothers. Marion followed, because Marion always followed. She was the car. Go in this arrangement, and she understood it, and she did not protest it publicly, and she continued to perform with the same undiminished craft in whatever vehicle the man who controlled her career. By the mid-1920s, Marion Davies and William Randolph Hearst had moved the center of their life together to San Simeon. San Simeon was, and remains, one of the most extraordinary private constructions in American history. Hearst had begun building it in 1919 on a hilltop on the California coast, 200 miles south of San Francisco, using the land his mother had left him. 27 miles of Pacific coastline, rolling hills, the specific grandeur of the California coast, in its uninterrupted condition. What he built on that hilltop was not exactly a castle, and not exactly a palace, and not exactly a museum, though it contained elements of all three. The main building and 3 guest houses together exceeded 90,000 square feet. There were 56 bedrooms. There was a private movie theater, a billiards room, a tennis court, 2 swimming pools, 1 indoor and 1 outdoor. The outdoor one lined with ancient Roman-style colonnades and filled with water that was heated to maintain a constant temperature regardless of the coastal weather, and a private zoo containing giraffes, elephants, polar bears, zebras, and exotic birds. The guest list for the weekend parties that Marion hosted at San Simeon across the following 2 decades reads like the complete index of the American entertainment industry between 1920 and 1940. Clark Gable, Cary Grant, Jean Harlow, Charlie Chaplin, Gloria Swanson, Gary Cooper, Bing Crosby, Greta Garbo, Charles Lindbergh, Winston Churchill, and every other name that mattered in film, politics, or society during the period. Marion was the hostess. She was always the hostess. Hearst was the owner of the castle, the builder of the swimming pools, the man who had filled the rooms with antiquities purchased from European estates during periods of historical turbulence. But the life in the castle, the warmth of it, the humor and the energy, and the parties that people remembered 30 years later with a nostalgia that had more to do with feeling than with opulence, that was Marion. It was also, beginning in the early 1920s, the place where a secret was kept. At some point between 1919 and 1923, the precise date is uncertain and was never publicly established, Marion Davies became pregnant by William Randolph Hearst. Hearst was still legally married to Millicent. He had separated from her, but had not divorced her and could not divorce her. A child born of this relationship would have been illegitimate by the legal standards of the time and would have been a public scandal of the kind that even the most powerful newspaper publisher in America could not entirely manage, particularly given that managing it would have required either his newspapers or someone else's to print the story he was suppressing. He sent Marion to Europe to have the child in secret. He joined her there. The child, a girl, was born in a Catholic hospital outside of Paris, sometime between 1920 and 1923. She was given to Marion's sister Rose, whose own child had recently died in infancy, and was raised as the daughter of Rose and her husband, George Van Cleve. She was given the name Patricia. Patricia Van Cleve grew up at San Simeon, attended the Lawler Professional School and several other schools whose fees were paid by Hearst, traveled to Europe with Hearst and Marion on multiple occasions, and was always introduced to every guest in every context. As Marion's niece, the daughter of her Aunt Rose, Marion reportedly told Patricia the truth about her parentage when Patricia was 11 years old. Hearst confirmed it to Patricia on her wedding day, the day she married the actor Arthur Lake, the man who played Dagwood Bumstead in the Blondie film series. Both Marion and Hearst reportedly walked her down the aisle on a day on which the public fiction was that the groom was marrying his girlfriend's niece, and the private reality was something else entirely. Patricia Van Cleve Lake carried this secret for more than 60 years. She carried it through the deaths of Hearst in 1951 and Marion in 1961. She carried it through her own marriage and the birth of her own children. She never commented on her paternity publicly, not once, in any interview or any statement, while either of her parents was alive or in the years after their deaths. In October of 1993, Patricia Van Cleve Lake was dying of lung cancer in Indian Wells, California. She was in her early 70s. 10 hours before her death, she asked her son, Arthur Lake Jr., to make a public announcement. She was not Marion Davies' niece. She was Marion Davies' daughter. She was the only child ever born of the 34-year relationship between Marion Davies and William Randolph Hearst. Her son complied. The announcement was published in her death notice. A spokesman for Hearst Castle called it a very old rumor, and a rumor is all it ever was. The rumor had, in fact, been circulating since the 1920s, quietly and persistently, in the specific way that Hollywood secrets circulate, known to everyone who needed to know, unpublishable in a city where every newspaper was owned by the man at the center of the secret. On the 15th of November 1924, a film producer named Thomas Ince boarded William Randolph Hearst's yacht, the Oneida, at San Pedro. Ince was 42 years old. He was one of the most significant figures in the history of early Hollywood. The man who had invented the system of script-based, budget-controlled film production that the studio system would use for the following century. He was also, in November of 1924, in serious financial difficulty. The independent production company he had built was struggling. He needed a deal. Hearst had invited him for the specific purpose of discussing a partnership. Cosmopolitan Pictures would use Ince's facilities. Money would flow in the direction Ince needed. The party aboard the Oneida was a birthday celebration for Ince and a negotiation conducted in the guise of one. Also aboard the Oneida that weekend, Charlie Chaplin, Marion Davies, Luella Parsons, then a relatively obscure gossip columnist, a Hearst-employed physician named Dr. Daniel Goodman, a jazz band, 15 guests total, and in the ship's gun cabinet, a pistol that Hearst was known to keep aboard the Oneida for reasons that the documentation available does not explain. It was also prohibition. There was illegal alcohol aboard a boat owned by the most powerful newspaper publisher in America, a man who did not drink and who had very specific rules about drinking in his presence, but who tolerated a certain amount of it in his guests when the occasion demanded. Ince arrived late. He had business commitments in Los Angeles that delayed his departure, and he joined the party in San Diego the following day. On the morning of November 17th, Ince was removed from the yacht at San Diego in a condition described as serious. He was taken ashore by dinghy. Dr. Goodman, the Hearst-employed physician, accompanied him and was told, by the account that emerged afterward, to be discreet. Thomas Ince died 3 days later. The death certificate listed heart failure as the cause of death. He had a documented history of stomach problems and chronic illness. His body was cremated before any examination could be performed. A doctor employed by the man on whose yacht he had been staying signed the death certificate. The front page of the morning edition of the Los Angeles Times, a Hearst rival, reportedly carried the headline, "Movie Producer Shot on Hearst Yacht." The afternoon edition carried no such headline. The headline, if it existed, has never been located in surviving newspaper archives. One of Chaplin's servants later stated that he had seen Ince removed from the yacht bleeding from a head wound. Hearst subsequently expanded the nationwide syndication of Luella Parsons's gossip column, making her, almost overnight, the most powerful columnist in Hollywood. The timing of this professional promotion, coming within weeks of the death of a man on his yacht, was noted at the time and in every subsequent account of the incident with the particular significance of a fact that means something without quite proving anything. The most persistent version of what actually happened is this. Hearst, who was pathologically jealous of Marion's attention to other men, had invited Chaplin aboard the Oneida, despite knowing or suspecting that Chaplin and Marion had been conducting an affair. Late at night, he went looking for Chaplin. In the darkness of the yacht's interior, he found a man he believed to be Chaplin. He shot him. The man was not Chaplin. Chaplin and Ince were of similar build and height. This account cannot be confirmed. D.W. Griffith, who knew Hearst and knew the events that followed, said years later, "All you have to do to make Hearst turn white as a ghost is mention Ince's name. There's plenty wrong there, but Hearst is too big to touch." Thomas Ince's widow received a substantial trust fund from William Randolph Hearst shortly after her husband's death. Hearst also paid off the mortgage on the family home. Charlie Chaplin later denied having been on the yacht at all. Marion Davies supported Chaplin's denial publicly. The district attorney of San Diego conducted an investigation in which exactly one person was interviewed, Dr. Daniel Goodman, the Hearst-employed physician who had attended Ince on the dinghy and been told to be discreet. No further investigation was conducted. The case was closed. Thomas Ince has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in front of a storefront. William Randolph Hearst has a castle on the California coast that receives approximately 800,000 visitors per year. Nobody was ever charged with anything. The relationship between Marion Davies and William Randolph Hearst was not, despite the 34-year devotion that surrounded it, a relationship defined by faithfulness on either side. Hearst was not faithful. He conducted a relationship with a blonde chorus girl named Maybelle Swore during the years of his life with Marion, and he made the specific mistake, the mistake that reveals more about his judgment than almost any other documented moment, of beginning to promote Swore's career in his newspapers with the same machinery he had used for Marion. Marion was, according to her close friend and confidant Louise Brooks, incensed by this. The infidelity itself she could manage. The deployment of the publicity machine, the machine he had built for her, in the service of another woman, was something she could not. Marion was not faithful either. She had a documented history of affairs with men outside the Hearst relationship, conducted within the complicated geography of a life spent inside Hearst's world but not entirely defined by his rules. Charlie Chaplin was the most famous and the most consequential of these. Dick Powell was another. There were others. The relationship between Marion and Chaplin was the specific nerve that the Thomas Ince incident touched, and the specific nerve that Hearst's jealousy returned to throughout the life of the affair. Chaplin was everything Hearst was not: young, funny, physically present in a way that a 50-year-old, then 60-year-old, then 70-year-old man could not compete with, regardless of the scale of the castle or the number of swimming pools. What Marion and Hearst had built together was not a conventional relationship. It was something stranger and more durable than that. A partnership organized around mutual need and genuine affection, and the specific complication of a power dynamic so extreme that neither of them could have described it clearly if asked. He needed her to make his castle a home. She needed his money and his machine to maintain the career she had. They also, by every available account from the people who observed them across 3 decades, genuinely loved each other. In whatever sense of the word was available to 2 people in that specific arrangement, they loved each other. She sold her jewelry in the late 1930s when Hearst's empire went into financial crisis. She wrote him a personal check for $1 million. She handed it to him without drama and without apparent expectation of return. He had spent $156 million promoting her career. She spent $1 million saving his, and considered the debt on her side. In 1941, Orson Welles released Citizen Kane. Welles was 20. Whether Marion actually never saw the film is a question that the people who knew her best declined to answer definitively. What they confirmed was that she never spoke against Welles publicly, never gave an interview attacking the film, never allowed anyone in her presence to use the incident as evidence of injury. She said when asked, "I had no anger toward Orson Welles. After all, everybody is created to do their very best." Hearst, by contrast, was not remotely calm. He instructed his newspapers, which at the height of his empire had been read by 1 in 5 Americans every week, to never mention Citizen Kane, not to review it, not to advertise it, not to acknowledge its existence in any form. He called in every favor available to him in the relationship between media power and the film industry, pressuring studios and exhibitors to block the film's distribution. He failed. The film was released. It was not a major commercial success at the time of its release, but it was recognized immediately by critics as the most formally innovative American film yet made, and the recognition has never diminished. Orson Welles later wrote the foreword to Marion's posthumously published autobiography. He wrote, "Marion Davies was one of the most delightfully accomplished comediennes in the whole history of the screen. She would have been a star if Hearst had never happened." He also wrote, "As one who shares much of the blame for casting another shadow, the shadow of Susan Alexander Kane, I rejoice in this opportunity to record something which today is all but forgotten, except for those lucky enough to have seen a few of her pictures. The regret was genuine. The damage was permanent." The film that defined Orson Welles' career and is still regularly cited as the greatest American film ever made spent its final act depicting Marion Davies as a talentless alcoholic whose only cig. By 1937, Hearst was $126 million in debt. The Depression had consumed the magazine revenues. The newspaper properties were bleeding. The castle at San Simeon had cost, by conservative estimate, more than any single private construction project in American history. The art collection alone, the medieval tapestries, the Spanish ceilings, the Greek statues, the Egyptian antiquities, represented a financial commitment that had seemed reasonable during the years when the Hearst Empire was at the height of its income, and now represented an impossible weight. Cosmopolitan Pictures folded in 1938. Marion's film career, which had been the organizing purpose and the public rationale of her relationship with Hearst, was over. She was 41 years old. She had made 45 films. She had been, for a decade and a half, one of the most recognized faces in American cinema. She had been #1 at the box office, and she had hosted parties that every significant person in the world had attended. And she had done all of this while the man whose name was on the production company was simultaneously controlling her career in ways that had prevented her from being what she might have been if she had been left to make her own choices. She later claimed in her autobiography that she had simply grown bored with film acting and decided to retire. The private audio diaries tell a different story. In them she described drunk at parties in the late 1930s and 1940s, cursing everyone she felt had contributed to her ruined career. The specific, particular resentment of a woman who understood exactly what had happened and had decided, in the interest of the man she loved and the life they had built, not to say it out loud while he was still alive. The drinking had begun earlier. It had worsened steadily through the late 1930s and into the 1940s, as the world of San Simeon contracted, and the guests stopped coming, and the zoo animals were sold, and the castle was handed over to a management company, and the most glittering social world the Hollywood Golden Age had produced was simply gone, and in its place was an old man declining slowly in a hilltop castle with a woman who was drinking to manage what she was not able to say. In 1947, the financial situation was severe enough that Hearst moved out of San Simeon entirely and into a Beverly Hills mansion that Marion owned. He was 84 years old. He was in physical decline. Marion tended him. She organized his care. She was there every day. He lasted until 1951. In the final days of August 1951, the Beverly Hills mansion was full of Hearst family members. The 5 sons had come. Other family had come. Nurses and doctors were managing the situation with the particular professionalism of medical staff who understood that what was happening was not a crisis to be resolved, but a conclusion to be witnessed. Marion Davies was in the house. She was also, by the account of what followed, in a state of considerable distress that was being managed medically. She had been sedated. The noise and the crowd and the knowledge of what was coming had produced in her a remorse. Action that required chemical intervention. She was sedated in another room while William Randolph Hearst died. When she woke up, the house was empty. His family had taken his body without telling her. They had made the arrangements, contacted the funeral home, organized the transportation, and left the Beverly Hills mansion with the man she had loved for 34 years, while the woman who had tended him through his final years slept in another room under sedation. She said later that she did not know he was dead. She woke up and the house was empty, and she did not know. This detail, the empty house, the sedated woman, the body taken without a word, has been documented in multiple accounts by people who knew Marion Davies and who understood it as the defining moment of the relationship's conclusion. Not because it was cruel, necessarily. The family had claim and custom on their side. He was their father, their husband, and the protocols of grief and burial belonged to them by the social and legal architecture of the time. But the architectural fact that Marion Davies had no legal claim on anything, not on the man, not on the body, not on the public role at the funeral, was, in the end, the clearest statement available about what 34 years of devotion had and had not earned. The funeral was handled by his family. Millicent Hearst, who had not lived with him since 1919, presided. Marion did not attend. In his will, Hearst had provided for Marion generously. He left her 170,000 shares of Hearst Corporation stock, plus 30,000 shares in a trust he had established for her in 1950. This gave her, briefly, a controlling interest in the Hearst Corporation. She sold it. She sold the controlling interest back to Millicent Hearst for $1. Whether this was grief or fury, or something that combined both without being able to distinguish between them, Marion never fully explained. 10 weeks after William Randolph Hearst's death, Marion Davies married Horace G. Brown. Brown was a merchant marine officer, a man she had known for years as a friend. He was also, by the observations of every person who commented on the resemblance, a man who looked strikingly like a younger William Randolph Hearst. Whether the marriage was love or comfort, or the specific variety of grief that sometimes expresses itself by reaching for whatever is closest to the thing that has been lost. Marion never explained this either. She married him. They remained married until his death in 1961, the same year she died. What she did without Hearst was discover, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was an extremely capable woman of business. She invested in property. She purchased the Desert Inn in Palm Springs. She bought several office buildings in Manhattan, including the Squibb Building at 5th Avenue and 58th Street, the Davies Building at East 57th Street, and the Doris Building at East 55th Street. She managed these investments with the competence and the attention of someone who had spent 34 years watching the most powerful businessman in America conduct his affairs and had absorbed, despite never being given formal credit for, it, a detailed education in how power and money actually operate. She also, in 1952, donated $1,900,000 to establish a children's clinic at UCLA, one of the largest single charitable donations made by an individual in Los Angeles to that point. The clinic was later renamed the Mattel Children's Hospital. Part of the UCLA Medical Center still carries her name. The woman the film had turned into Susan Alexander, the talentless, helpless, alcoholic prisoner of a powerful man, gave away nearly $2 million to sick children and built a real estate portfolio and managed her own affairs with a clarity and a competence that the film's portrayal would never acknowledge. She had a minor stroke in 1956. She developed osteomyelitis of the jawbone and required surgery. She fell in her hospital room after the surgery and broke her leg. She recovered. Her last public appearance was on January 10, 1960, on an NBC television special called Hedda Hopper's Hollywood. She was 63 years old. She looked, by the accounts of people who watched the broadcast, like someone who had managed a great deal and was not particularly interested in discussing the management of it. She was diagnosed with stomach cancer in 1961. On the 22nd of September 1961, Marion Davies died at her home in Los Angeles. She was 64 years old. She was buried in the Duras family crypt at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, under her family name, the name she had been born with, not the stage name she had taken from a real estate sign in Brooklyn, not the name of the man who had spent $156 million turning her into something he wanted her to be. Marion Cecilia Duras, the girl from Prospect Park in Brooklyn, the one who had a stutter, the one who was funny. Citizen Kane won one Academy Award. It won for screenwriting. It lost Best Picture to How Green Was My Valley, a decision that film historians have relitigated in every decade since, and that some of them believe was influenced by the industry-wide pressure Hearst brought to bear on everyone in a position to vote. Marion Davies, by Orson Welles' own admission in the foreword to her autobiography, was one of the great comic performers in the history of the medium. She would have been a star, he wrote, if Hearst had never happened. The sentence is precise and devastating in a way that Welles may or may not have fully intended. She would have been a star if Hearst had never happened. Not she was a star. Not she was a star despite him. But she would have been a star if he had not occurred in her life. The conditional tense, the life that existed in the space between what she was and what she might have been. The secret daughter whose existence was kept for 60 years died in 1993, having carried the knowledge of who she actually was through the entire adult lives of both her parents. She had grown up at San Simeon, played with Clark Gable and Charlie Chaplin and Jean Harlow at the parties Marion hosted. She had been walked down the aisle by both parents, who stood beside her in the public roles of aunt and family friend, while the private truth was something else entirely. She had kept the secret until the last 10 hours of her life. The man who may or may not have shot Thomas Ince on a yacht in November of 1924 had his investigation closed after one interview, conducted by a doctor in his employ. D.W. Griffith said all you have to do to make him turn white is mention Ince's name. Griffith is dead. Hearst is dead. Ince was cremated before his body could be examined. The case is, in every practical sense, permanently closed. And Marion Davies, who was present on the yacht and who knew more than she ever said about what happened, who was the woman in the middle of every significant event in the story of William Randolph Hearst's final 3 decades, who was the reason the party was on the yacht and the reason the gun was there, and possibly the reason the wrong man was shot, Marion Davies kept that secret too. She was very good at keeping secrets. She had been keeping the biggest one since 1919 or 1920 or 1923, whenever the child had been born in the Catholic hospital outside Paris. What she was not able to keep was the one thing the film took from her. The film turned her into a woman who needed to be rescued and then showed her unable to be rescued. And the portrait was so persuasive and so widely seen that it became the version of her that the world retained. The real Marion Davies wrote a personal check for $1 million to the man who had spent 34 years controlling her career. The real Marion Davies woke up one morning to find the house empty and the man she had loved for 34 years gone without a word. The real Marion Davies took the controlling interest she briefly held in the Hearst Corporation and sold it back to his wife for $1. And then the real Marion Davies got up and went to work and donated nearly $2 million to sick children and built a real estate portfolio in Manhattan and appeared on television at 63 and died at 64 of stomach cancer and was buried in Hollywood under her family name. She was not Susan Alexander. She was never Susan Alexander. She was the girl from Prospect Park who had a stutter and was funnier than almost everyone else in the room, and the man in the front row of the Follies had decided he wanted her, and she had spent 34 years finding out what that decision actually cost. If Marion Davies' story stayed with you, subscribe to Silk and Sorrow. These are the women whose real lives were nothing like the stories told about them, and whose real lives were always more interesting than the fiction. Next week, Norma Shearer, the woman who married Irving Thalberg and used his position as the head of MGM to secure every role Marion Davies had been denied, who became the Queen of Hollywood by understanding exactly how power worked and who had it, and whose reign ended the moment her husband died. The story of what happened when the most strategic woman in Hollywood lost the man who was her strategy. That story is next.